What's happening today has never happened before. A nuclear power has invaded another country and they say, I want to redraw the maps. This territory that's not mine, I want it to be mine now. And if I don't get it, I'm going to nuke people. Nobody has done this in the last 75 years. This is a new thing. The clip I see of Russian soldiers on the front lines, they're slave soldiers. They don't actually want to be doing this. They're being forced to do it at the barrel of a gun by their commanding officer. Russia has to ration. They didn't budget for having 3 of their largest depots blown up by the Ukrainians. Of Russia's credible deterrence factor, given that their Sarmat missile just blew up in the hole 2 weeks ago. This missile was supposed to prove Russia's independence from Ukraine. I think everything President Zelensky has been doing the last year has been in anticipation of this November election. The invasion of Kursk by Ukrainian forces was to shape the narrative, to shape the battlefields. If you look at the square kilometers that Ukraine took inside of Kursk in the first month, it was more progress than the Russians made in the Donbass region the previous 9 months. You can get out a map and measure it all.
Welcome back to Byline on the front line, and we're delighted to be joined again by Jake Broe. He's been an esteemed guest with us before. He's a former missileer, i.e. he was an officer in control of nuclear and other missiles for the United States Air Force. So he knows his military technology and strategy really well, and has become, over the last year or so, an amazing, profound and go-to commentator on Ukraine. So it's great to have you back with us, Jake. So before we go to the strategic stuff that's been happening, particularly with Zelensky's visit to the US, that's President Zelensky of Ukraine. He met Kamala Harris, he met President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump. And it was a very interesting exchange of ideas and different optics. But before we go to that, can I just ask you a bit about the front line? So my understanding, Jake, was that one of Putin's major objectives was to show a major advance in Donetsk, in the southeast of Ukraine, and Pokrovsk was a key target. Meanwhile, obviously, we have this major incursion into Kursk Oblast in the Russian Federation by Ukraine. And obviously, I imagine he wanted to expel the Ukrainians from his own territory. Where are we now? Is Putin near to achieving any of those objectives on the ground?
On my YouTube channel, I'm personally not a big fan of map update changes. I don't think this war will be won or lost with map update changes. If the Russians take Vuhledar, if the Russians take Pokrovsk, the war is not over for either side. The lines have just slightly shifted by a couple kilometers. When you get out the ruler and measure how far the Russians have gone in 2.5 years to get through Avdiivka, let's just say it, they took Avdiivka earlier this year. Republicans in Congress blocked military aid for 8 months, and that's what caused this breakthrough of the Russian forces to get within artillery range of Pokrovsk. They haven't taken the town, but they're currently destroying it building by building, firing North Korean ammunition to destroy this Ukrainian town, pre-war population 60,000. The shifts in the front lines are not going to be decisive for either side. This is a game of politics being fought currently. It's a game being fought with billions of dollars and sanctions and trade relations. That's going to be who's going to win this war. Who has better connections, who has more resources, who has better allies, basically.
And as you say, you point out rightly, that there's been very little movement. I mean, the biggest movement was in Kursk Oblast. And so things are not going to be resolved on the front line in kilometers or more destroyed buildings. Russian occupation seems to amount to destruction most of the time. What, therefore, on the more strategic, again, on the sort of munitions and military side alone, and not the bigger picture which you paint so well of politics and sanctions, where there's been more diminishment of Putin's stocks, his reserves. I mean, there were apparently hasn't been confirmed that one of the munitions bases blown up had North Korean missiles. Is there going to be a problem with him on munitions, or is there just enough stocks on both sides, maybe, particularly on the Russian side, they can continue bombardment and destroying bits of Ukraine. That doesn't mean very much politically. Or do you think there are going to be supply side problems for the Russian army and the Russian military soon because of these attacks?
So there's depots and then there's arsenals. And Ukraine in the last week and a half successfully destroyed 2 arsenals and 1 depot. The depot was in Krasnodar. The 2 arsenals were in the Tver Oblast. And nobody knows how much ammunition, missiles, rockets, whatever, were in these depots. But from the seismic activity and the satellite images, this was substantial. How much of Russia's firing on the front lines was expended in these successful jet drone attacks by Ukraine? Experts are giving an analysis of 3 to 4 months worth of total munitions being used on Ukraine for the war effort. So that means Russia has to slow down. Russia has to ration. They didn't budget for having 3 of their largest depots blown up by the Ukrainians. And they've got a serious problem. There was another attempt 2 nights ago on an additional depot in the Krasnodar region. It doesn't look like it was successful based on the firm data, but we don't know exactly what Ukraine was doing. Was this we're going to get it 100%, or was this a probing activity? Perhaps they sent in 5 or 6 drones just to see where the air defense missiles were coming from. There is a report that prior to the arsenal that was destroyed a week and a half ago, they took out a radar installation first. So can the Russians see it coming? Are these jet drones good enough? We don't really know. There's still a lot that Ukraine has in development that can change this war. I think 3 of their arsenals blowing up in the last 2 weeks is pretty substantial. On top of that, General Mud will be arriving soon. As we get into the muddy season of Ukraine, I don't think either side is going to be making much progress as far as shifting the lines on the battlefield.
Yes, no, you make this point about how the frontline changes are incremental. They don't change the bigger picture. They get frozen, don't they, soon? General Mud is because the rainy season, tracked vehicles find it difficult to move, soldiers seek more cover, and then maybe, depends on the weather, we'll get a great freeze. So in a way, it looks like the front lines aren't going to move that much, which may be worse for Putin in that it looks like he'll difficulties ejecting Ukrainians from Kursk. So we have that sort of culmination, don't we, around the end of the summer when it is more difficult for manoeuvred attack and it's less pleasant to be in trenches soon. Is there also another factor taking us to the bigger issue, the other deadline for all this? And it's somewhere way away, 3,500 miles away, and that's the US presidential elections. Because obviously America's the biggest supplier of arms. Well, that's debatable, actually, isn't it? There is a lot of supply from the EU, but let's say the biggest single supplier of arms and military support. Do you sense there has been an attempt to culminate on the battlefield around the elections? And Zelensky went to DC to present his peace plan. The Russians have their own peace plan. Do you feel it's all coming to a head around something happening on November the 5th?
Absolutely. I think everything President Zelensky has been doing the last year has been in anticipation of this November election. The invasion of Kursk by Ukrainian forces was to shape the narrative, to shape the battlefield. If you look at the square kilometers that Ukraine took inside of Kursk in the first month, it was more progress than the Russians made in the Donbass region the previous 9 months. You can get out a map and measure it all. So I don't like holding up a map and saying, look, who took more territory? This person must be winning. But if members of Congress want to bust out some maps when they're debating additional military aid on the floor of the House and Senate, this helps get military aid passed to Ukraine. We also dispelled Russia's narratives of red lines that weapons can't be used within 100 kilometers of the border. Western weapons, Western tanks, Western APCs are being used inside of Russia to defeat the Russians, to protect Ukraine's sovereignty. And nobody's been nuked. Everything that Russia has been threatening the last 2.5 years, it's been complete nonsense. Russia has no power, and if we want to be honest, people are very skeptical now of Russia's credible deterrence factor, given that their Sarmat missile just blew up in the hole 2 weeks ago. This missile was supposed to prove Russia's independence from Ukraine. Their ICBM fleets, going back to the Soviet eras, most of their components were made in Ukraine by Ukrainians. So this Sarmat missile that was supposed to take off less than 2 weeks ago was supposed to be entirely Russian-made, and it blew up in the hole. So going back to the election and politics, yes, this was a incredibly productive week for President Zelensky. He met with over 30 world leaders because of the UN General Assembly also occurring at the same time, met with both members, leading members of the Senate. He didn't meet with Speaker Johnson, but he met with lots of other House members, and then obviously Biden, Harris, and Trump. And the top news story that nobody is talking about is that President Biden announced the largest military assistance package ever. $5.5 billion in drawdown authority. This was money that was going to expire at the end of the fiscal year. On top of that, there was another 2.4 from a different pool of money. In total, $8 billion was announced in military assistance for Ukraine. That is the largest military aid package ever announced from the United States to Ukraine, and these munitions and weapons are going to start arriving over the next couple months.
Wow. So while that's all going on, the real world stuff, which you understand so well with your insight and your background, what happens, obviously, on social media and in the presidential campaign is the first time ever, I think, I've seen, well, two statements. The one, a statement during a rally from President Donald Trump. I have to call him president, I think, if I'm an American, but I'm going to call him former president. Basically gets his MAGA crowd to boo Zelensky. I'm sure you've seen that clip. There's obviously a faction in the Republican Party, as always has been, which has been close to Putin, a growing faction who's delayed these, arms approvals. And obviously some of his audience do follow social media, do believe these ridiculous stories like put out by these Russian-funded news operations that Zelensky is the most richest person in the world. But you know how things play at home. How's that booing Zelensky really going to work with somebody of Ukrainian or Polish background in Pittsburgh or Pennsylvania?
This is a losing political issue for Donald Trump, which is why he's been so careful to avoid talking about it the last 6 months. Whenever Trump would be asked about Ukraine, he would just say, "I'll solve it in a day. I'm not going to give you my specifics. It's too early to talk about specifics, but I have the power, even before I'm elected. Once I'm the president-elect, I'll call up my buddy Putin, I'll call up Zelensky, and I'll force these two to negotiate, and we'll have a fair and equitable deal." That was his standard talking point until the last week. And then Zelensky showed up at this artillery factory in Pennsylvania, and that triggered Trump.
Right.
Trump has such thin skin. It is so easy to upset him, manipulate him, get him to go on these tirades. So, yeah, this speech of him speaking to his supporters at a rally in Georgia, saying that the United States has already given Ukraine over $300 billion, and the Europeans are deadbeats. NATO is useless. They're not helping Ukraine at all. America's doing everything. President Zelensky is the greatest salesman in the world, and every time he shows up to America, he walks away with a check for $100 billion. He said a bunch of other insane stuff about all the crops being dead and Ukraine is gone, everything is destroyed. Yeah, there was a negative reaction to that because 60% of Americans, a full 50% of registered Republicans, support additional military aid for Ukraine. Not all Americans who support Ukraine support military aid, but they still think Ukraine is in the right, that Russia is the aggressor. It's a very small percentage of Americans, around 10%, who are pro-Russian. They think NATO expansion is the cause of this war and Russia is just defending their sovereignty. So this is a losing issue for Donald Trump. I hope he talks about it more. I can tell just from the comment section on my YouTube videos, he's losing votes. Every time he attacks Zelensky, every time he encourages his supporters at his rally to boo President Zelensky. You then had this absurd meeting in Trump Tower. Trump wasn't going to do it, but then he saw Zelensky meet with Kamala Harris. That once again set him off. He quick got on his jet, flew back to New York. Had, in my opinion, a non-productive meeting. the photo of Trump with Zelensky at this absurdly oversized marble table, and there's no flags, there's no water, there's no notes. I don't even think there was a translator there. So Zelensky had to do his best in English to plead his case and advocate for his people, the victims of genocide. Putin is the aggressor. Putin is an internationally wanted war criminal. And Donald Trump won't stop declaring that he's good friends with Putin and they have great relations. As an American, this is dumbfounding. I'm not going to stop beating this drum. Anybody who says they support Ukraine, at this point, you cannot be voting for Donald Trump.
I mean, you raise that question, or you make that point, that in polls, it's only about 10% support Putin or pro-Russian in this terrible war, which Russia initiated, which nearly all the very few Russian civilian casualties, uncounted, innumerable Ukrainian casualties, civilian casualties. You know, the missiles are deployed randomly on hospitals and schools. I've been in Kherson, I've seen that. Meanwhile, you obviously have targeted operations from Ukrainians. But among that 10% who do support Russia for some reason, for whatever bizarre reason, would you include Donald Trump? Do you think, I'm not saying he's a Russian agent, but is he a Russian asset? He seems very reluctant to make any criticism of Vladimir Putin, the Russian president. It's almost like he fears some kind of retribution if he did criticize him.
He doesn't fear retribution. He loves and admires these people. Donald Trump has never met a dictator he didn't instantly fall in love with. Anything they want, Donald Trump will roll over and show his belly for just a warm pat from Kim Jong-un or President Xi. I remember listening to Donald Trump in 2016 when he first ran, and he was very tough on China. And then he actually met the emperor himself, and they shared a beautiful piece of chocolate cake. That's a detail he repeats commonly. And then he said, basically, China's cool. They give trade patents to my daughter. You know, they invest in my companies. I recently read in Anne Applebaum's latest book that 20 to 25% of all condos purchased on Trump properties are purchased anonymously. We don't know who's buying these properties. In real estate, you can move money around. So I'm confident Russian oligarchs, Chinese oligarchs, whoever, yeah, they're making it known that they love Trump, they support Trump, they're funneling money to Trump. And Trump's only cared about himself. He's only cared about his bottom line his entire life. I mean, the list just gets weirder and weirder when we talk about Trump and Kim Jong-un's relationship. In 2018, he famously declared that Kim Jong-un wrote him beautiful letters. Those are his words. And they fell in love. The president of the United States declared he had fallen in love with the dictator of North Korea. So this network of these guys who stay in power for life and they're all super rich, Donald Trump just looks at that with admiration. He has no reverence for the lore of American history. Trump, after he lost the 2020 election, called for suspending the Constitution so that he could stay in power forever. Trump declared on day one he will be a dictator. He will be a dictator on day one. That was a stupid thing to say. He said it. We have the quote. I can just keep going on and on. It just gets more and more absurd. This is part of Donald Trump's mental jujitsu that he plays on the American people. The media can't stick with one story when the next day he says something more insane and nonsensical. So as Americans, we're just being exhausted by him. We're being blitzed by him. I'm laser focused on this one issue. I'm not going to talk about all the other insane things he says and does. And yeah, I'm going to remind my audience every day. You can't say you support Ukraine and vote for Donald Trump. The events of this last week and everything he said and did prove that.
I mean, wonderful description you're giving there of the bromance of the autocrats, that if there's never a dictator Donald Trump hasn't met, that he hasn't fallen in love with. I do want to bring you back in a moment to what you think is going to happen with the elections in Ukraine, without predicting what your sense is. But just because, you mentioned 2016, obviously the first invasion of Ukraine and annexation of Crimea was in 2014. Similar time when Donald Trump was trying to do business in Moscow. But putting that aside, you've looked at a lot of wars. You've been very, in the military yourself for many years. How does this war compare with other conflict situations you've known about or analysed in your lifetime?
Since the end of World War II, this has been the most peaceful time in human history. I know it doesn't feel that way, but prior to 1939, it was continuous war. Everyone in the world was just killing each other incessantly. Humanity is the darkest aspects of humanity is brutal. And there was so much optimism and hope when the United Nations was created. When you actually learn about the creation of the United Nations and what people actually believed, there was this utopianist vision that we could put all this death behind us. And the Kremlin said no. The Soviets said no. They didn't liberate Eastern Europe. They then occupied Eastern Europe for another 45 years. And when we compare and talk about other wars and today, what's happening today has never happened before. A nuclear power has invaded another country, and they say, I want to redraw the maps. This territory that's not mine, I want it to be mine now. And if I don't get it, I'm going to nuke people. Nobody has done this in the last 75 years. This is a new thing.
Threatened to do it. They haven't actually nuked us yet, but that's the threat, you're saying.
Yes, a nuclear power is saying, we have nukes, we want our empire back. If we don't get our empire back, we're going to nuke people. This is a new thing. And in the United States, France, UK, the democratic nuclear powers are trying to figure out how to respond to it, how to counter it. The autocratic nuclear powers basically all have their heads in the sand. They also don't want to talk about it. This is a very uncomfortable position for world leaders. And the Russians are saying, just stay out of it, just stay out of it. Let us destroy Ukraine. We're going to take it. You can't stop us. But if we're being brutally honest, the Russians are incompetent. How could they not win this war in the first 2 weeks, given their economic size, military advantage? I was covering the events of this war the first 2 weeks, and I just was saying, how is this possible? How are the Russians so incompetent, given their vast Soviet stockpiles? So yeah, Ukraine won me over when President Zelensky refused to take that helicopter ride out of the country. He chose to stand and fight. I feel like I've been a part of this war for the last 2.5 years, and Ukraine's going to win because the Russians are corrupt and incompetent. It doesn't matter what you look at on the books. It comes down to the people and who wants it more. And every video clip I see of Russian soldiers on the front lines, they're slave soldiers. They don't actually want to be doing this. They're being forced to do it at the barrel of a gun by their commanding officers.
I don't know if you've seen, there's the Zelensky story. It's a BBC documentary about the Ukrainian president. Very moving. And there's a great moment. We know the famous video when I'm staying and he has his, senior ministers behind him. I'm with you. And that was sort of, people say, it was a turning point in world history, let alone the war. There's another amazing moment where I think it's the chair of the parliament comes to see him and the cabinet. What we're going to do is within hours of the strike, he's being targeted with assassination missiles are coming in. It looks like the capital is going to be encircled. And Zelensky turns to him and said, well, fate has chosen us, which is like one of the best ever pep talks you could imagine, really. But before I go, just you've given. I completely agree with you about the personnel. About Ukraine has everything to gain by survival. Russians are fighting for face, land not their own. They can't be defeated. But the question of nuclear weapons is this new world, and it's amazing, isn't it? It's nearly 80 years. Next year, it'll be 80 years since nuclear weapons were used destructively on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and they haven't been used for 79 years, let's hope 80. You're saying something has profoundly changed now, that you have this nuclear threat for around the conventional war. You, somebody who's worked, as an officer in nuclear missiles, what do you think the outcome of all this is? Is it that somehow deterrence will end, or that somehow the more likely if we give in to Putin that he will use, it's a very complicated world, especially for older friends of mine who will go, oh, just don't want to avoid World War III, nuclear exchange, nuclear winter, just give Russia what it wants. People do say that. What do you make of this new world that we're now inhabiting in that strategic deterrence logic?
Two things. The first one is that if this works, then other people are going to do it. If Russia can say, I want to redraw the maps, I want to take my neighbor's territory, I have nukes, you have to allow me. Well, now every other dictator in the world with nukes is saying, well, that works.
Yeah.
If I just attack Taiwan, if I just attack South Korea, if I just attack whoever, and then scream, I have nukes, you have to let me take my neighbor's territory, what's the Western Alliance going to do? Right now, NATO and the Western Alliance is at the strongest it will ever be. If Ukraine falls and Russia absorbs their people, Russifies them, mobilizes them, and sends them to die in the Baltics, it's the exact same position. Give me the Baltics, otherwise I'll nuke you. I have 6,000 nukes. Okay, Putin takes the Baltics. What's next? Kazakhstan? Poland? Finland? The Caucasus? Armenia? China? With Taiwan? So that's the one nightmare scenario. The other one is, well, now the only way to stop your big nuclear-powered neighbor from attacking you is to get nukes yourself. Right. And do we really want South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Poland, Finland, Armenia, I don't know, getting their own nuclear weapons, because that's the only real deterrence. That's the only thing that these dictators actually respect. Who has the big guns? If Ukraine had kept their nuclear weapons 30 years ago, they wouldn't be attacked right now. That's an obvious fact to everyone in Ukraine, and this is the message being spread around the world. The only real safety you have, you're not going to find safety in allies with nuclear weapons. You got to get your own, and nuclear proliferation just makes the world more dangerous for everyone.
That's a brilliant analysis, Jake. I suppose one could also beg the question, actually, what strategically and tactical use a military weapon of small scale tactical nuclear weapon would be in this situation. I mean, I don't know if militarily what difference it would make. I suppose you could just see Putin could destroy his towns a bit quicker, but it's not going to convince anybody in Ukraine. But the proliferation point is very well made. And also, do we know, and you as your background, you noted this missile, their own version of the Ukrainian built missile exploded. Does Putin trust his technology enough to be able to even launch one? And what would be the consequences with his allies in North Korea or China?
Putin knows that there's a lot of corruption and incompetence in his military, and that's the system he's built. The Russian military can only function with corruption. Why would you give up all your personal liberties? Why would you give up your freedom? Why would you give up your right to have a say in how your government does unless you're able to engage in corruption? The Russian government deliberately pays their officers not a good amount of money. They deliberately pay their police forces and their security forces not a lot of money so that they engage in corruption. Corruption is not a byproduct of a lack of democracy. It's a key feature, because once you get everyone to be a criminal, once everyone is engaging in some form of corruption, robbing the locals or robbing the state, you're now part of the system. You're now complicit in the crime, and you're not going to rebel against it because you're now afraid you'll be held accountable. So Putin knows that he's got problems, but he still thinks the mass and size of Russia and Russia's superpower, their greatest strength for the last 500 years, is the willingness of their people to suffer. Their willingness of the Russian people just to take the absolute worst conditions and the worst treatment from their own government without rising up. And I'm saying that on top of the fact that Russia's had 2 revolutions in the last 105 years. Everyone's saying that Russia's never going to fall apart, Russia's never going to collapse. Based on historical precedents, Russia is, aside from maybe Argentina, the most likely country in the world to have an economic or a political crisis and then collapse. Russia's just been falling apart and putting itself back together again time after time. I know this is a more dangerous world we're heading into if Russia falls apart, if Russia breaks up, and regional warlords start fighting each other with nuclear weapons. But Putin didn't give us a choice. This was Putin's decision, and the Russian people are complicit in it for not putting a stop to it.
And those, actually, I think you could, if you extended it to 120 years, 3 times there's been a revolution after military misadventure. I think the 1904-5 was failing a military campaign against Japan, and they obviously had World War One. And then really, I suppose you could argue the 1991 revolution was out of the failures in Afghanistan. So it's a very well made point that this they're brought upon themselves. And anyway, they didn't descend into regional warlords with nuclear weapons in 1991, so why should it in 2025? But we remain optimistic. Jake, it's great talking to you with such a breadth of historical and military and political and moral knowledge. I hope you will join us again. Hopefully, maybe a bit near the election, we'll have more to say. And while things might not shift much on the ground, they may do in other places.
Thanks for having me on.